In the dead of a blizzard-swallowed night, a single bark shattered the silence, dragging with it a flash of fear and a secret that could change everything. In that moment, life and death hung by a single breath, and no one knew if the light would return before the darkness consumed it all. Subscribe now so you won't miss our most gripping and captivating episodes. The wind in Montana that night was more than just cold, it had teeth. It tore through the skeletal pines like some unseen predator, rattling loose shutters on abandoned cabins and grinding ice across the frozen ground. The storm had been building for hours, moving in from the mountains, swallowing what little warmth remained in the valley. By midnight, the snow was coming sideways, erasing roads, blurring lines between sky and earth. Out here in the far north stretch of Gallatin County, the world had narrowed to white shadow and the kind of silence that could unnerve even the most seasoned local. Jack Turner knew this part of the state the way a scar knows the skin it lives in. He'd driven these back roads in summer when dust hung in the air and the mountains stood proud under an endless sky. And in autumn, when the forest turned gold and red before surrendering to the cold. But winter was something else entirely. Winter tested you. It stripped away illusions, left only what could endure. Tonight he wasn't sure where he stood on that scale. The wipers of his Ford Expedition groaned against the ice building along the edges of the glass. His hands wrapped around the steering wheel in fingerless gloves felt the vibrations of the road, or what was left of it, through the tires. There was no traffic. No one sane enough to be out here now. The last gas station he'd passed had been 40 minutes back, its sign flickering in the storm like a distress signal. The radio was his only companion beyond the steady breathing in the back seat. Shadow lay curled on a heavy-duty blanket, the black and tan of his coat muted in the dim cabin light. The German Shepherd wasn't sleeping exactly. Jack had learned that Shadow rarely did when they were out in the field. The dog's eyes followed the flicker of snow outside his ears, twitching every so often, as if cataloging each shift in the storm's voice. Shadow was the kind of partner who never wasted movement, never let his guard down, just because the world seemed still. Jack's own body carried its share of vigilance. Even after 2 years out of the bureau, his muscles moved like a man still expecting trouble at any second. The past was stitched into him in the faint ache in his left shoulder from a bullet wound in Baltimore, in the scar along his jaw from a knife in Juarez. And deeper than the scars, there was the thing he never spoke about, the mistake that had cost a child's life. It was the reason he'd left, the reason nights like this found him in a patrol SUV for the county sheriff's office instead of an FBI field vehicle. The storm howled across the radio antenna, a constant white hiss that he'd learned to tune out. He kept the volume low enough to catch any incoming call from dispatch. Gallatin was quiet most nights, drunks in the bars, the occasional snowmobile accident. But this storm had locked the whole town indoors. He thought about calling it in, heading back to the station, thawing out his hands over a bad cup of coffee. Shadow lifted his head before Jack could reach for the mic. It was a small movement, but deliberate. The shepherd's ears went forward, his body shifting as he fixed on the radio console. Jack frowned. "What is it?" he asked, as if the dog might answer. Shadow's gaze didn't waver. A second later, the static in the speakers stuttered. At first, it was nothing more than a glitch, a faint break in the hiss, a click of open air. Then it came again, longer, and underneath something fragile. A voice. Jack's pulse ticked up. He leaned forward, turning the volume dial until the speakers hissed louder. For a moment, it was only static. Then through the white noise, a whisper thin and trembling. "Help me." Jack sat straighter. The words were warped by the interference, but they were unmistakable. A child's voice. He reached for the mic. "This is Turner Unit 4. Repeat transmission, I'm receiving a distress call." He let go, listened. Static. Then again clearer this time. "Is somebody there?" Shadow was up now, paws planted nose toward the windshield, as if scent could travel through sound waves. Jack's heart thumped once hard. He pressed the mic. "Yes. This is Deputy Turner with Gallatin County Sheriff's. Can you tell me your name?" The pause was long enough for him to think the signal had died. Then the voice returned weaker. "I'm cold, and the walls are moving." Jack felt his jaw tighten. "What's your name, sweetheart? Where are you?" Nothing. Only static and the faint sound of breathing, labored shallow. "Dispatch, you copy," he said into the mic. "We've got a possible child in distress, unknown location. Can you run a triangulation on my frequency?" The familiar voice of dispatcher Maria Ochoa came back calm, but with an edge she didn't bother to hide. "Working on it. Hold that channel open." Jack stared at the windshield where the snow blurred into a tunnel of shifting white. His mind began to map possibilities. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was a CB bleed from a long-haul trucker with kids in the cab. But there was something in that voice, a raw, unguarded fear that cut through his training and went straight to instinct. Maria came back on. "Got it. Signals pinging from the West Industrial Sector. Closest match is Ridgeway Timber Camp. That place hasn't been active in 20 years. Jack swore under his breath. He'd been out there once on a trespassing call. The old logging buildings were collapsing on themselves. The trailer's gutted roofs caved in under decades of snow. And beyond them, the land dropped into dense forest. If a kid was out there tonight, they wouldn't last an hour. "I'm en route," he said, already throwing the SUV into gear. "Requesting backup." "Negative," Maria replied. "Road closures have the plows stuck up near Highway 12. You're the closest unit." Of course he was. Jack slammed the light bar switch, and the SUV's strobes turned the snow into a blur of red and blue. Shadow braced himself as they hit a patch of ice and corrected. Jack's focus narrowed to the GPS screen and the vague gray lines that passed for roads in this weather. They left the last streetlight behind within minutes. The world became nothing but the howl of the storm, the crunch of tires over frozen ruts, and the steady sweep of the headlights carving a path through the white. Jack's knuckles whitened on the wheel. He knew how fast hypothermia could set in on a child. Add in whatever moving walls meant, and the clock was already running out. "Hang on, kid," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. The snow deepened as they climbed a low ridge. Shadow shifted to the passenger seat nose near the defroster vent, scanning the dark like he could will something into view. Jack let the dog's restlessness guide his own attention. Shadow had saved his life once in a warehouse bust gone wrong, pulling him out seconds before a wall collapsed. He trusted the shepherd's instincts more than most people's plans. The GPS marker blinked, indicating the general vicinity of the source. Jack slowed, squinting through the windshield. Shapes emerged in the beams. Low buildings, warped fences, stacks of rotting lumber buried in snow. The Ridgeway site. He rolled to a stop, killed the strobes, and let the engine idle. The storm pressed close, swallowing sound. He cracked his window. For a moment, nothing but wind. Then faint, almost lost in the gale, a sound. Not the voice from the radio, but something sharper, metallic. A distant clang as if something had been dropped, then silence. Shadow's head turned toward it instantly. Jack eased the SUV forward tires, crunching over hard-packed snow, until they were in the shadow of the largest structure, a long, sagging bunkhouse. The roof had partially collapsed, snow drifting through the gaps. He scanned with his spotlight, catching on another building beyond it. Smaller. A cabin, its front porch half buried in snow smoke, or was it steam curling from a hole in the roof? Something inside Jack shifted. That cabin didn't belong here. Ridgeway's buildings were all industrial. This was residential. And wrong. He reached for his mask and flashlight. "Stay with me," he told Shadow, even though the dog was already at the door ready. Snow knifed into his face the second he stepped out, searing the skin. The air carried a strange smell, wood smoke, yes, but under it something acrid. Burned plastic. Jack moved toward his cabin boots, sinking deep. His light swept across the front windows. The glass was blackened from the inside. The radio on his shoulder crackled, Maria's voice breaking through. "Jack, you still on scene? I've got eyes on a possible structure fire," he said, moving to investigate. "You want me to patch in fire? They won't make it in time." He clicked off and reached down to unclip Shadow's lead. "Search," he ordered. The shepherd bounded ahead, nose low, weaving through drifts until he reached the front steps. He stopped tail stiff and looked back at Jack with an intensity that needed no words. Jack's breath came in clouds. The storm roared around them, but inside the cabin he knew it was worse. He didn't know what he'd find, only that somewhere beyond those burned walls, a little girl's whisper had crossed the frozen miles to reach him, and he wasn't about to let that be her last word. The roar of the fire was alive, devouring the old timber, like it had been waiting years for this moment. By the time Jack and Shadow crested the icy ridge and saw the cabin, the night sky above Montana was already lit with a pulsing orange glow. Flames curled from the windows, snapping the glass like brittle ice, sending shards into the snow. The wind caught the smoke, whipping it sideways in violent gusts that stung Jack's eyes and made every breath taste of ash. Shadow growled low in his throat, half warning, half readiness, as if he could sense what was trapped inside. Jack didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into park, grabbed the crowbar from behind the seat, and barreled toward the collapsing porch. The snow under his boots crunched sharp, then turned slick where embers had melted into slush. The heat hit him in waves, each one more suffocating than the last yet. Beneath the roar of the fire he caught it, an unmistakable metallic clatter. Chains. They were moving. They were dropping to his knees. Near the warped wooden steps, he pressed his ear to the floorboards. The sound was clearer now. Chains jerking metal on metal, and the ragged breaths of someone in panic. Jack's chest tightened. The only way down was through the kitchen, and judging by the buckling walls, he had minutes at most before the structure folded in on itself. Shadow bolted ahead, vanishing through the open doorframe. Inside, the air was thick, boiling. Jack forced his way into the kitchen, using the crowbar to clear debris. He scanned the smoke-filled room, eyes stinging, lungs clawing for oxygen. Then he saw the faint outline of a trap door in the floor, its edges blackened from the heat. The chain noise was louder here, echoing up from below. He jammed the crowbar under the warped wood and wrenched with every ounce of strength. The hatch groaned, resisted, then finally gave with a splintering crack. A rush of heat and smoke surged upward, carrying the smell of scorched metal and something far more human: fear. "Shadow down," he barked. The dog dropped into the dark without hesitation. Jack followed, feet hitting the ladder so hard the metal rang under his boots. The basement was barely a room, more like a dugout, carved into the frozen earth. Flames danced across the ceiling as burning insulation rained down. Against the far wall, two small figures cowered, their wrists chained to a rusted pipe. One was older, maybe 10, with tangled dark hair clinging to sweat-damp cheeks. The other was smaller, her eyes wide and glassy, her breathing erratic. "It's okay, I've got you," Jack shouted over the noise. He moved fast, prying at the chains with his crowbar. The metal groaned, but didn't break. Shadow planted himself between Jack and the falling debris, Hackle's raised teeth bared at the fire, as if it were an enemy he could drive back. Jack switched tactics, pulling the bolt cutters from his pack. The first cut snapped one chain, and the older girl, Ellie, clutched her sister Grace, holding her close despite the chaos. Jack cut the second chain and scooped Grace into his arms. The ceiling above cracked like a gunshot. A burning beam gave way, plunging toward them. In a blur of motion, Shadow lunged, shoving Jack sideways with his weight. The beam slammed into the ground where Jack had been, the heat searing his cheek. Shadow yelped, but didn't falter, nudging Jack toward the ladder with urgent force. "Go up!" Jack barked. He shoved Ellie ahead of him, still carrying Grace. Every rung burned his hands through the gloves, but he climbed lungs, burning vision tunneling. They exploded into the night air, just as the basement roared in collapse. Jack stumbled into the snow, dropping to his knees with the girls in his arms. The cold was a shock, biting and clean after the furnace below. Ellie coughed hard, then pressed her face into Grace's hair. Shadow emerged seconds later, his coat-singed eyes glinting in the firelight. Jack was about to check them over when something caught his eye. On Ellie's left wrist, beneath the grime and soot, was an ink mark. Not just a random tattoo, this was precise, deliberate. A ring of barbed wire encircling a single dagger, its hilt engraved with tiny, almost invisible letters. He knew it instantly. The Iron Veil. A name Jack had buried years ago, along with the case that had nearly ended his career. Seeing it here, burned into the skin of a terrified child, was like opening a door to a room he'd sworn he'd never enter again. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the sound of distant sirens too far away to be any help. Jack met Ellie's gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, though her lips trembled. "You're safe now," he told her. though the weight in his voice betrayed the truth. Safe for now was all he could promise. Behind them, the cabin gave its final groan and collapsed into a heap of embers. Shadow pressed against Jack's side, a silent reminder of what they'd just survived and what was still coming. The iron veil had left its mark here, and Jack knew marks like that were never just for show. They meant someone was coming to collect. And tonight, in the dead heart of a Montana winter, the storm was only just beginning. The storm hadn't let up. Snow came down in sheets, the kind that blurred the world into shifting shadows and white noise. But Jack pushed the truck harder than was smart. The heater groaned against the cold, fogging the windshield at the edges. Grace had gone quiet in the back seat, bundled in a thermal blanket, her head resting against Ellie's shoulder. Ellie hadn't loosened her grip once, not during the drive, not even to take the water bottle Jack had offered. Her eyes stayed locked on the road ahead, like she was listening for something Jack couldn't hear. By the time they rolled up to the old timber frame building that served as the town's temporary medical station, Jack's hands were aching from the steering wheel. The structure had once been a general store. Now, in the middle of a winter emergency, it was a patchwork clinic, 2 curtain bays, a triage table, and a makeshift waiting area, stacked with space heaters that never seemed to do enough. Jack carried Grace inside, the warmth only barely cutting through the chill in his bones. The place smelled faintly of iodine and wet wool. A radio hummed low in the corner, broadcasting updates about road closures and missing persons. From the far end of the room, a woman stepped out from behind the curtain. She was tall, wiry, with a braid pulled over one shoulder and a parka hanging open over scrubs. Her boots were dusted with snow like she'd only just come in herself. "Jack Turner," she said, voice flat but not unfriendly. "Didn't think I'd see you out in this storm. Didn't think I'd find 2 kids chained up in a burning cabin either," he replied. "They need to be checked over smoke inhalation, maybe burns." Her eyes shifted to Ellie, then lowered to the bandage Jack had hastily wrapped around her wrist. For a fraction of a second, something in her expression flickered. Not just recognition alarm, but it was gone before Jack could read more. "I'll take them," she said, voice quieter now. "I'm Nora Hayes. We'll get them stable." Nora guided Ellie and Grace toward one of the curtain bays. Jack followed, not ready to let them out of his sight. Nora worked quickly, checking their vitals, listening to their lungs cleaning away soot. When she reached Ellie's wrist, the bandage slipped, revealing the tattoo beneath. Her hand froze mid-motion. Her eyes lingered on the ink as if she were tracing the design in her mind. "Where did you get this?" she asked softly. Ellie said nothing. She glanced at Jack, then back to Nora, lips pressed tight. Grace leaned closer to her sister, as if the question itself was a threat. Jack's jaw tightened. "You've seen it before," he said, making it less a question and more a charge. Nora hesitated, then shook her head too quickly. "Just seen a lot of strange things out here." She pulled the bandage back over Ellie's wrist, the motion almost protective. Before Jack could push, Shadow's low growl cut through the air. The dog was still by the door, head angled toward the frosted window. His ears were sharp, body rigid. Jack moved to the glass, wiping the condensation with his sleeve. Outside, barely visible through the curtain of snow, a shape emerged, a boxy silhouette idling near the edge of the lot. The headlights were off, but the glow from the clinic's porch light caught the flat black paint, the wide grille. Not local, not random. The vehicle didn't linger. As soon as Jack's eyes locked on it, the engine revved and it rolled backward, tires crunching over snowpack. It didn't turn toward town or the main road. It slid away into the trees, disappearing into the dark like it had never been there. Jack's gut twisted. Someone had come to see if the girls were still breathing. Now they knew the answer. He grabbed his radio, thumbing the mic. "This is Turner. I need a plate run. Black box truck, no lights left. The medical station heading east on Mill Creek Trail. Possible connection to the Iron Veil." Static hissed back at him, the storm chewing through the signal. No confirmation, no dispatch, just dead air. When he turned back, Nora was watching him. "You think they're after the kids?" she said, not asking. "I know they are," Jack replied. "And now they know exactly where to find them." Nora's face hardened. She looked toward the curtain bay where Ellie and Grace sat, huddled together, their silhouettes small against the dim light. "Then you'd better figure out what you're going to do, because this place isn't built to keep anyone safe. Jack didn't need the reminder. The Iron Veil wasn't just a gang, and it wasn't just a rumor from his past. It was a network deep, organized, and patient. If they had marked Ellie, it meant she wasn't just a target. She was a piece of something larger, and they'd burn the world to get her back. Shadow came to stand beside him, muscles taut, eyes still fixed on the window. The dog didn't relax, and neither did Jack. The night outside seemed thicker now, as if the snow itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the tree line, a black truck was making its way through the drifts, and Jack could feel the truth settle cold in his chest. Tonight's fire hadn't been meant to kill the girls. It had been meant to erase them. And now that they'd survived, the real danger was only just beginning. The storm had deepened, pressing against the clinic walls like a living thing. The howl of wind through the eaves made the rafters groan, and the light inside flickered every few seconds, as if the power lines were deciding whether to give up. Jack stood near the window, watching the snow swirl under the porch light. But his attention was on Nora. She was pacing. Her boots tracked wet, dirty arcs on the floor. She kept glancing toward the curtain where Ellie and Grace huddled together. Shadow curled protectively at their feet. Grace's eyes were downcast, her thin shoulders tucked in, like she was trying to disappear into herself. Ellie, by contrast, kept one arm locked around the dog's neck. Her body half turned toward the door, as if ready to put herself between Grace and whatever might come through it. Nora finally stopped pacing. She blew out a slow breath and crossed to Jack. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the sound of the wind. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you decide whether you want to walk out of here with those girls." Jack's gaze sharpened. "You've got a history with the Iron Veil." She flinched at the name. Not much, but enough for him to catch it. "I used to work for them," she admitted. "Not by choice. Years back I was doing contract veterinary work, military canines, law enforcement animals. They brought me in on a private job. Said it was for a security firm. It wasn't. It was them." Jack didn't interrupt. They weren't just running dogs for intimidation. They were training them for specific operations. Tracking, guarding, even taking down targets. They paid well, kept things quiet. I told myself I was just there to keep the animals healthy, but... Her voice tightened. They weren't just training dogs. They were training people alongside them. And some of those people weren't there voluntarily. Jack's jaw set, the kids. Nora's eyes flicked toward the curtain again. "I don't know for certain, but I've seen that mark before. The one on Ellie's wrist. It's not just a tattoo. It's a tag. They used it for property. Animals, gear, sometimes people. Anyone or anything they considered theirs. The word property landed like a weight between them. I left when I realized what I'd gotten into." Nora continued. "They don't like people walking away. I've been off their radar for 2 years, moved here, kept my head down. But if those girls came from one of their compounds, they're more than just victims. They're witnesses. And the veil doesn't leave witnesses." Jack studied her. He could tell she was leaving things out, the kind of things that made people wake up sweating at 3 in the morning. But there was truth in her voice, raw and unvarnished. Behind the curtain, there was a small sound, Grace shifting in her chair, the squeak of vinyl under her weight. Jack glanced in, catching the moment Ellie looked up at him. Her eyes were a shade too old for her face, shadowed by something that didn't belong in a child. Shadow lifted his head, sensing the tension, and Ellie's arms tightened around him, like he was the only solid thing in the room. "You're safe here," Jack said, knowing it was a lie, even as he said it. Grace didn't respond. She sat with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, eyes fixed on the floor. Jack turned back to Nora. "If they're after the kids, this station's the worst place to keep them. Too visible. Too many ways in." Nora nodded. "You've got somewhere else in mind." Jack hesitated. There was a place. He hadn't been back in years, a cabin deep in the woods, off any marked trail built by his grandfather as a hunting lodge. No phone line, no neighbors for miles, and only one road in that wasn't really a road. He'd used it a few times when he'd needed to disappear back when he'd still been wearing a badge. "It's not on any map," he said finally. "And I'm the only one with a key." Nora's gaze held his. Then you take them. Tonight. If the Veil knows they're alive, they'll be moving already. And if they catch up, they won't care about collateral damage. He didn't ask what she meant by collateral. He already knew. Jack moved fast after that. He had Nora pull together a basic med kit, oxygen canister inhalers, burn salve a thermal blanket for each of the girls. He took bottled water, a box of protein bars, and an old snow lantern in case the truck's lights went out. When he told the girls they were leaving, Ellie didn't question it. She stood still, holding Shadow's collar, and helped Grace to her feet. Grace followed silent, her small hand buried in the fabric of Ellie's coat. They stepped out into the storm, the cold slicing in like a blade. Snow swirled in every direction, erasing distance, making the whole world feel smaller and more dangerous. Jack opened the truck's back door, helping them climb in, then nodded for Shadow to follow. The dog hesitated, ears back, scanning the tree line, before jumping inside. Nora came to the door. She didn't step out, but her eyes met Jack's through the falling snow. "If they find you," she said, "don't try to fight them head-on. They don't play fair, and they don't play small." Jack gave a curt nod. "Stay inside. Lock up. And if you see that truck again, I'll be gone before they can knock." He slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away from the clinic. The tires bit into the snowpack, then slid before catching again. The road ahead was a ghost, only the faint rise of drifts showing where the ground fell away. In the rear view, the clinic's light shrank to a pinprick and then vanished. The storm swallowed it whole. Jack kept his hands steady on the wheel. But his mind was already moving ahead to the cabin, to the back trails he'd have to take, to the fact that every mile they covered tonight was a mile the Iron Veil could be closing from the other direction. Beside him, Shadow lifted his head and stared out into the darkness, ears twitching. In the back, Ellie sat pressed against Grace, her eyes never leaving the window, as if she could see through the storm and spot the danger coming. Jack didn't tell her that sometimes you couldn't see it until it was already here. The storm had swallowed the cabin by the time Jack cut the truck's engine. Snow pressed against the windows, muting the world into a heavy, suffocating silence. Out here in the folds of the forest, the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and likely snowed in themselves. That isolation was what Jack counted on, and what now weighed on him. The cabin was old, but solid cedar walls, a steep pitched roof, and a front porch half buried in white. Inside, the wood stove fought to drive the cold from the room. Jack moved methodically, checking the locks, latching the shutters, and pushing a heavy trunk against the back door. Ellie sat cross-legged on the braided rug with Shadow beside her, both facing the crackling fire as if drawing heat from its center. Grace perched in a corner of the couch, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. She was small enough to vanish into the cushions, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. Jack watched them for a moment before heading to the back door. "Shadow," he called. The dog lifted his head, ears flicking, and trotted over. The training began immediately. Jack stepped into the narrow mudroom, opened the outer door just a crack, and pointed toward the tree line. "Perimeter," he ordered. Shadow didn't hesitate, pushing into the snow and disappearing into the swirling white. Jack stood at the doorway, watching the vague shape of the dog, weaving through drifts, moving like a shadow between the trees. Every few minutes, Shadow would reappear, shake the snow from his coat, and then vanish again, a silent sentinel tracing invisible borders. "You trained him for this?" Ellie asked from behind him. "Trained him for worse," Jack replied, still scanning the dark. "But this he was born for." Night dropped hard in the mountains, bringing a deeper cold that bit through the seams of the cabin walls. Jack made them eat canned soup, heated on the stove, bread gone a little stale, but still good when toasted. Ellie ate quietly, eyes darting toward the windows every time the wind shifted. Grace barely touched hers. By 10 o'clock, Jack sent them to the back bedroom, a small space with bunks and heavy quilts. Shadow made a final sweep before padding inside, settling near the girls like a silent guard. Jack stayed up, stoking the fire and keeping to the front window. The snow was still falling, thick enough to muffle sound, thick enough to hide things until they were close. It was just past midnight when he saw it, the faint sweep of light cutting through the trees. Not lightning, not a snowmobile's headlamp. This was sharper, steadier, moving in an arc like a search pattern. Jack killed the lantern. Darkness dropped into the cabin, leaving only the faint glow of the banked stove behind him. He eased to the window, peering through a slit between the shutters. Another beam of light sliced the night, this one closer. Then another from a different angle. Whoever was out there wasn't passing through, they were searching. His pulse tightened. They'd moved fast, too fast. Jack crossed the room, opened the bedroom door a fraction. "Ellie, wake up." His voice was a whisper edged with urgency. She stirred, rubbing her eyes. Grace blinked at him from the lower bunk, her hair a dark tangle against the pillow. "Stay quiet. Stay with Shadow." Ellie nodded, gripping the dog's collar as if she could anchor herself to him. Grace's gaze followed Jack as he closed the door. The light swept again now, skimming the edge of the clearing. Snow reflected them in shards, like the night itself was fractured. Jack slipped his rifle from behind the wood box, checking the chamber by touch. He was calculating angles, planning how to move them deeper into the woods, if it came to that, when a voice cut through the stillness. "They're going to find us," Grace said. The sound of her voice froze him. In all the hours since they'd left the clinic, she hadn't spoken a single word. Now her tone was calm, almost detached, as if stating a fact she'd already accepted. Jack turned toward the bedroom. She was standing in the doorway barefoot, the hem of the quilt trailing in one hand. Ellie was behind her, looking uncertain whether to pull her back or follow her forward. "They'll find us?" Grace repeated, her dark eyes steady on his. "The same way they found Mom." Ellie's breath hitched audibly. Jack crouched down, setting the rifle against his knee. "Grace, look at me." "How do you know that?" "They never stop," she said simply. "Not when they want something." The words landed heavy, full of things unsaid. Outside, the lights kept sweeping, methodical, relentless. Somewhere beyond the trees, Jack could hear the faint crunch of boots on crusted snow. They were spreading out. He rose, crossing to the stove, throwing another log in to keep the glow low but steady. He didn't want the cabin to look abandoned. That would invite them to check inside, but he needed to buy time. Back in the room, he told them, his voice low but firm. "Lock the door. Shadow stays with you." Ellie tugged Grace back, but the younger girl's eyes lingered on him until the door closed between them. Jack moved to the back window. Through the narrow crack in the shutter, he caught a glimpse of figures moving, dark shapes against the snow hoods, pulled up, flashlights in hand. They weren't talking. Professionals didn't need to. He counted 3, then 4. And if there were 4 in sight, there could be more circling. The night closed in tighter. Snow hissed against the glass. Shadow's muffled growl carried from behind the bedroom door. Jack gripped the rifle harder. Whatever this was going to turn into, it had just stepped out of the shadows. The wind had died down by morning, but the snow still hung in the air like a thin veil, drifting slow, silent. Jack moved through it without a sound, his boots cutting narrow trails toward the old barn that leaned into the slope like a forgotten relic. Nora kept close behind her scarf, pulled high eyes scanning the tree line, with attention that wasn't just about the cold. Shadow was ahead of them, tail low, ears sharp, pausing every few steps to test the air. Grace's words from the night before had set this in motion. "They'll find us, like they found Mom." She had said it with a clarity that didn't match her age, as if she was recounting a memory too heavy to carry alone. Jack had pressed her gently, and she'd whispered about the dark place under the wood, about walls that smell like metal, about a ladder that went down instead of up. That was enough for Jack to recognize what it might mean, and enough for Nora's face to lose all color. The barn was older than anything else left standing in these hills. Its wood was gray, stripped bare by decades of storms, the roof sagging in the middle like a tired spine. Jack pushed the warped door inward, and the scent hit first, a damp rot laced with rust, like water standing too long in an iron trough. Inside, light slanted through broken boards, painting the dirt floor in fractured bars. The place was empty at first glance, nothing but discarded hay bales and the skeletal frame of an old plow. But Jack didn't look at the obvious. His gaze tracked the floor, searching for edges, for irregularities. Nora kept to the wall, her breath shallow. "I used to hear them talk about places like this," she said, voice low. "Not barns, holding points, before transport." Shadow padded toward the far end, where a collapsed section of wall let in more light. He stopped suddenly, nose to the ground, then veered toward a mound of rotting wood stacked in one corner. His claws scraped as he pawed at the boards, dislodging them in thuds that echoed in the hollow space. Jack joined him, shoving the last of the planks aside to reveal a square of steel set into the floor. A trap door flush with the dirt, its surface mottled with rust. The kind of thing you'd never see unless you knew where to look. He knelt, brushing away grit to expose a recessed handle. Cold metal bit into his palm as he pulled. The hinges shrieked a sound too loud in the stillness, and a square of darkness yawned open beneath them. The air that rose up was colder, denser, tinged with the smell of wet stone. A ladder disappeared into that black. Grace was right, Jack muttered. Nora's hand tightened on the strap of her pack. This isn't just a cellar. No, Jack agreed. It's a way down. He took the first step onto the ladder, testing its weight. Steel rungs slick with condensation, the walls close enough to scrape his shoulders. Nora followed the sound of her boots on the metal ringing sharp in the confined space. Shadow stayed above until Jack gave a low whistle. Then the dog began a careful descent pause, finding each rung with instinctive precision. The ladder ended in a narrow corridor cut into stone, the ceiling low, the air heavy with silence. Jack's light beam slid over rough walls that glistened faintly with moisture. The ground underfoot was hard-packed earth, interrupted by the occasional patch of concrete. Shadow's pace slowed, his ears tilted forward, nose working overtime. They passed a side alcove where the ceiling dipped lower, and there on the wall Jack saw it. Names, scratched into the stone in uneven lines as if by small hands with dull tools. Some were half-faded, swallowed by moss. But one stood out fresh enough to still hold its shape, Miller. Nora stepped closer, running her fingers over the grooves. Her breath caught audibly. Miller, she murmured. I know that name. There was a boy, 10, maybe 11, pulled from a raid in 21. They said he'd been gone for years. His last name was Miller. Jack's jaw tightened. And this could be him, Nora said. Could be family, could be... She trailed off, but her eyes stayed on the name, as if she couldn't look away. Shadow gave a low, throaty growl and moved ahead, nails clicking against a stretch of concrete. Jack followed, keeping his light low. The corridor bent sharply left, and there it was, the door. Steel thick with rivets set deep like scars. Its surface was scuffed, scraped in long arcs, and the locking mechanism was a heavy plate bolted across the center. From the other side came a sound, faint but distinct. A dragging. Metal on stone, slow, deliberate, pausing every few beats as if to listen. Jack raised a hand, signaling Nora to stillness. The sound came again, longer this time, like a chain being drawn across the floor. Nora's face had gone pale, but her eyes were steady. That's not an animal, she whispered. No, Jack said, voice low. It's not. He stepped closer, pressing one ear to the cold steel. The vibrations were faint, but there a tremor that came with each scrape. Something or someone was moving on the other side. Shadow planted himself in front of the door, muscles tense, a rumble building deep in his chest. Jack straightened, scanning the frame for weaknesses, for hinges that could be worked. Nothing gave easily. Whoever had sealed this door had meant it to hold. The dragging stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Then a knock, just one, slow, measured. Jack felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. What do we do? Nora asked. Jack kept his eyes on the door. We figure out what's in there, he said, before it figures out how to get out. Jack's hand hovered over the locking plate, the cold biting into his fingertips, as if the steel itself was warning him not to proceed. Nora stood a step behind her breath, shallow, one hand on the butt of the small pistol she carried more for comfort than for skill. Shadow was pressed low to the ground, head angled toward the door, every muscle wired tight. The scrape on the other side had stopped minutes ago, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to seep through the metal. Jack's instincts screamed that nothing about this was right. But Grace's whispered descriptions, the name on the wall, the fact they were already deep inside Iron Veil territory, turning back now, wasn't an option. He twisted the locking plate. The bolts retracted with a sound like bones snapping. The hinges groaned as he pushed, and the door opened just enough for a breath of colder air to slide through before something moved fast. A figure exploded through the gaps, slamming into Jack's chest. The impact drove him back into the wall, his shoulder crunching against stone. Pain flared, but training took over before thought could catch up. He pivoted, dropping low, one hand catching the attacker's arm to redirect the momentum. But the corridor was too tight, and the man recovered instantly, using his weight to shove Jack against the wall again. Black tactical gear, mask covering the lower half of the face, eyes flat empty, iron veil. Before Jack could adjust, a second figure slipped through the half-open door, moving with the same brutal efficiency. Nora's pistol came up, but the soldier was on her before she could steady her aim, knocking the weapon from her grip. It skittered across the floor and disappeared into the shadows. Jack caught a flash of the first soldier's gloved hand, going for something on his belt knife. He slammed his forearm down on the man's wrist, trying to break the grip, but the space was too confined to gain leverage. The knife came up the blade's edge, catching the glint from Jack's flashlight. Shadow moved. The shepherd's snarl was raw and primal, echoing in the corridor as he lunged, slamming into the man's side with enough force to break the stalemate. Jack felt the shift instantly and drove his elbow into the soldier's jaw. The knife clattered to the ground, and Shadow went for the man's arm teeth, finding the gap between glove and sleeve. Nora was struggling with the second attacker pinned against the wall, his forearm pressing across her throat. Jack stepped into him, catching his elbow, wrenching hard until bone and tendons protested. The man staggered, and Jack drove a fist into his solar plexus. The air rushed out of him, his grip on Nora loosening enough for her to drop under his arm and roll clear. The first soldier tried to drag Shadow off, but the dog held fast, jaws locked, body braced low. Jack reached for the man's shoulder, spun him, and drove his knee up into the soft space under the vest's side plate. The soldier folded, and Jack followed with a strike to the temple that sent him crumpling to the ground. The second soldier recovered faster than expected, pulling a short baton from his belt. He swung wide, and Jack caught the blow on his forearm. It sent a jolt of pain shooting up to his elbow. The man pressed forward, using the confined space to trap Jack against the wall. Nora, still catching her breath, scanned for her pistol. It was too far. Instead, she grabbed the fallen knife and stepped in from behind. Her voice was steady when she spoke sharp, cold. "Drop it." The soldier hesitated, his head turning just enough for Jack to see the opening. He twisted, trapping the baton arm, and slammed the man's head against the wall. Once. Twice. The resistance bled out of him, and he slumped. The corridor went quiet, except for the harsh rhythm of breathing Jack's, Nora's, and the soft growl still rumbling in Shadow's throat. Jack crouched, checking both men for weapons comms, anything useful. The first had a sidearm, a spare magazine, and a folded sheet of paper tucked into an inner pocket. Jack slid it out carefully. Under the beam of his flashlight, the paper revealed itself to be more than just a note. It was a map, hand-drawn, but precise. Black lines for roads, faint blue for waterways, red ink marking several locations with a small X, and the words TC Point. Nora's eyes narrowed. Transit center points. That's what it has to mean. These are where they move people. Jack studied it, memorizing the pattern. The points weren't random. They formed a route, one that stretched across state lines, converging toward a location far south. "We keep this," Jack said, folding the map and slipping it into his jacket. "This changes everything." A sound from the open doorway made them both tense, a muffled thud from deeper inside, followed by a low, metallic hum. "They'll know these two are down," Nora said. "We have minutes, maybe less." Jack glanced at the ladder they'd descended. Going back that way meant exposure. If more Iron Veil soldiers were already closing in from above, they'd be trapped. "Secondary exit," Jack said, scanning the corridor. "There's always a secondary." Shadow moved ahead, nose to the ground again, pulling them past the steel door and deeper into the warren of narrow passageways. Twice they hit dead ends, each time doubling back, with the sound of faint boots on concrete chasing them from behind. At one turn, Nora nearly slipped on a patch of water seeping from a crack in the wall. Jack caught her arm, steadying her, just as Shadow stopped ahead. Body rigid, head angled toward a section of wall that didn't match the rest, newer concrete smoother. Jack moved in, pressing his hands against it. Hollow. His fingers found the seam of a concealed panel. With a grunt, he forced it open, revealing a narrow service tunnel barely wide enough to walk through sideways. "This is it," Jack said. "Move." They pushed through the space, compressing the sound of their breaths into the close air. The tunnel angled upward, the incline steepening until Jack could see a faint light ahead. Daylight filtered in thin. The opening was covered by a rusted grate. Jack braced his shoulder and shoved the metal, giving way with a screech that made his teeth clench. Snowflakes swirled into the tunnel as he climbed out into the ruins of what had once been a tool shed. The roof half collapsed. Nora followed, then Shadow, who shook himself violently before standing guard at the opening. They were in the tree line now, the barn somewhere to their left. But already Jack could hear voices, shouts carrying over the snow. Iron Veil knew. "This way," Jack said, taking off at a crouched run through the trees, Nora and Shadow matching his pace. The cold air burned in his lungs, but the map in his jacket felt like fire against his ribs, a key that could open every door Iron Veil had built and maybe burn them down entirely. Behind them, the shouts turned into the sharp crack of gunfire. Snow kicked up at Jack's heels. They didn't look back. Not yet. Snowfall had eased into a slow, steady drift by the time Jack Turner returned to the cabin, the bitter wind still gnawing at his face. His gloves were stiff with frost, his breath a thin cloud under the fading moonlight. He had the rolled-up map clamped under his arm as if it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Shadow padded beside him, paws crunching over the frozen ground, ears swiveling at every distant creak in the forest. Inside, the wood stove's heat slapped against Jack's frozen skin, but it didn't soften the weight in his chest. Nora Hayes looked up from where she was tending to Ellie and Grace, her eyes scanning him for answers before they even spoke. Jack shook his head, tossed the map onto the table, and unrolled it with deliberate care. The surface was peppered with red circles, jagged lines, and handwritten notations in a scrawl that didn't belong to anyone meticulous. It was rushed, coded, and ugly. He pointed at one of the marks near the Montana border. "I sent a copy to someone I trust." Jack said, his voice low, deliberate. "He just called back. Told me this." He tapped the red mark is where the Iron Veil moves their shipments out of state. "And the leader? He's here, in the area. Not next week, not tomorrow. Tonight. Maybe a few hours from now." Nora's face hardened, the flicker in her eyes. Not fear, but a simmering awareness that something irreversible was about to happen. "You're saying?" "I'm saying if we miss this window, we may never see him again," Jack cut in. "And those kids they took?" He didn't finish. The weight of the unsaid was heavier than the words. Ellie seated on the floor with her knees tucked to her chest, had been quietly sketching in the dim light. The scratching of her pencil was the only sound for a few moments. Jack noticed her stop, tilt her head, and then slide the drawing toward him without a word. The paper was rough. The lines uneven, but the image was unmistakable. A bridge, its arch, old and sagging snow clinging to the railings, and beneath it, dark water swallowing the moonlight. Jack frowned. "What is this?" Ellie hesitated, eyes darting toward Grace, then back to Jack. "It's where I saw him," she whispered. "The man with the iron mask, the one who told the others what to do." Her voice trembled, but not from the cold. "They made us wait under the bridge before they put us in that house. He was there. He looked at me." Jack's pulse ticked faster. "This bridge, where is it?" Nora leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "I know it. It's about 5 miles south of the main highway. Old timber frame. They closed it off years ago when the river started eroding the supports." Jack grabbed the map, flipping it toward Nora. "Show me." She traced her finger along a narrow logging road until it reached a curve in the river. "Here." It wasn't far, but it was isolated, too isolated. If the Iron Veil leader was using it as a handoff point, it meant fewer witnesses and quicker getaways. It also meant whoever went there wouldn't get back up fast if things went wrong. Jack's gut churned. "This is our chance." Nora shook her head. "This is a trap. If he's there, he's not alone. You know that." "I know," Jack said. "That's why we're going in first. Quiet. Before they move." Shadow, as if sensing the shift in Jack's tone, stood and padded closer, tail stiff, head up. His ears pricked toward the door. "Jack." Nora's voice softened, carrying that unspoken plea she'd given him before every reckless choice. "You've already pulled these girls out of hell once. If you go out there now, if I don't, that hell keeps running, and more kids vanish." Jack's eyes locked on hers. "You've seen what they're capable of. Ellie reached out, fingers brushing the thick fur at Shadow's neck. "Can Shadow come?" she asked, her small voice wrapped in something almost like hope. Jack crouched down so he was eye level with her. "Shadow's always with me. But you and Grace stay here with Nora. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone who doesn't say the word Pinefall. Got it?" Ellie nodded, but her hand didn't leave Shadow's fur until the last possible second. Outside, the cold was sharper, slicing across Jack's face as he loaded the truck. Shadow jumped into the passenger side without hesitation. The map was on the dash, a flashlight, and a suppressed rifle in the back seat. Jack glanced at the cabin one last time, Nora's silhouette framed in the window, the girls huddled near her. The drive toward the bridge was slow, not because of the snow, but because Jack kept killing the headlights whenever the trees grew sparse. In the dark, the forest felt alive, branches shifting, snow slipping from boughs like muffled footsteps. 2 miles from the bridge, Jack cut the engine and let the truck idle into silence. The world closed in around him, only the low rush of the river somewhere ahead and the distant howl of wind through the timber. He and Shadow moved on foot boots, sinking into powder that swallowed the sound of their approach. Through the trees, the bridge emerged like the ghost of something that had once been proud. Its beams groaned against the cold patches of ice, clinging to the supports like veins of glass. A faint yellow glow leaked from beneath it, lantern light swaying in the draft. Jack dropped low, creeping to the edge of the embankment. Shadow mirrored him, every muscle coiled, nostrils flaring at the scent of strangers. 3 figures stood under the bridge. 2 were armed, pacing in restless patterns. The third was still, his coat long and heavy, his head covered by a hood that didn't hide the gleam of metal where a face should be. Jack didn't need to be told this was him. The leader. The iron mask caught what little light there was, an inhuman glint against the dark. Jack's pulse slowed, his training taking over. He scanned for roots cover from the right bank, possible escape through the frozen shallows, choke points if it turned into a fight. One of the armed men lit a cigarette, the flare briefly illuminating a battered crate at their feet. Stenciled letters on the side read, "Property, IV." It was small enough to fit a child inside. Jack's jaw clenched. He glanced at Shadow, who was trembling not with fear, but with readiness. He tapped 2 fingers against the snow, signaling wait. Shadow's tail twitched once. Jack's breath fogged the air as he studied the movements below. The man with the mask didn't speak, but the 2 guards moved as if tethered to his thoughts, adjusting their patrol without a word. The precision was unsettlingly military, but colder, like they'd practiced this ritual 100 times. One wrong move, and the bridge would become a kill zone. Jack eased back, pulling the radio from his vest. Static hissed, then cleared into a quiet voice, his old teammate Tom. "You there?" "I've got eyes on him," Jack murmured. 3 total, 2 armed. One's the leader. Crate's here. "Copy. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they load up. My team's still 20 out." "Too late," Jack said, sliding the radio back. He couldn't risk waiting. He signaled Shadow, who crept to his side. Jack's plan wasn't clean, it wasn't even smart, but it was the only one that might keep that crate from disappearing forever. From their cover, Jack angled toward the bridge supports, using the frozen driftwood as stepping stones. Every footfall was calculated, every breath timed to the wind's gust. When he reached the shadow of the bridge, he caught the faintest sound from inside the crate, a cough. Small, weak, human. Rage sharpened his focus. He raised his suppressed pistol, sighting the nearest guard. The shot cracked soft in the cold, the man dropping without a cry. The second spun weapon rising, but Shadow launched from the snow teeth, bared, colliding with the man's chest and dragging him into the riverbank. The masked leader didn't move at first. He turned his head slowly, the metal catching the lantern light. Then he stepped toward the crate. "Stop!" Jack's voice cut through the night. The leader paused, then lifted a gloved hand, not in surrender, but in signal. From somewhere in the trees, more footsteps began to converge. Jack's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a handoff. It was bait. The snowstorm had turned the world into a white void. The wind screaming through the skeletal remains of bare trees and across the frozen span of the old bridge. Jack crouched low behind a jagged concrete barrier, his breath fogging in short, controlled bursts. Beside him, the cold metal of his rifle bit into his gloves, the safety already off. Nora knelt 10 feet away, half hidden by a mound of snow. her eyes scanning through the sight of the scoped hunting rifle she had insisted on carrying. Shadow was nowhere to be seen by design. The Malinois had been trained for moments like this, melting into the snow, and Shadow silent until the exact second he was needed. Somewhere beneath that thick white blanket on the far side of the bridge, he waited, still patient, invisible. Jack checked his watch. Midnight. The storm was both curse and blessing. Visibility was barely 5 feet. But that also meant they could set up close without being spotted. The cold clawed at his bones, seeping through layers of thermal gear. But his mind was razor sharp. Somewhere out there, barreling toward this bridge, was the convoy carrying not just the goods Iron Veil was moving, but possibly answers, maybe even the man at the top. A sudden flicker of light. Far in the swirling curtain of snow, twin beams appeared, muted, distorted, growing brighter. Jack's heartbeat slowed, his breathing steady. Through the static whisper of wind, the deep rumbling growl of diesel engines emerged. One vehicle, then two, then three. A convoy. He tapped his earpiece, twice a signal to Nora. She didn't look at him, but her posture changed. She was locked in. The lead truck rolled onto the bridge, the crunch of heavy tires on compacted snow echoing into the storm. A faint gleam of black steel rails ran alongside, now icy and treacherous. Behind the first truck came another larger and covered its cargo, hidden under taut black tarp strapped down with metal hooks. Jack's mind cataloged details. License plate partially obscured by grime driver's profile, hidden by a heavy coat and ski mask, a faint shadow of movement in the back. He knew from experience that second truck was the one they wanted. The plan was simple in theory. Disable the lead and rear vehicles, trap the middle one, and take what they could before backup arrived. But in a storm like this, simple could turn into chaos in seconds. As the third truck began to roll onto the bridge, Jack flicked the safety off and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's suppressed bark was swallowed by the storm. But the lead truck's front tire burst in a violent spray of rubber and ice. The vehicle swerved hard, metal shrieking against the bridge's guardrail, before grinding to a halt, sideways, blocking half the path. Almost simultaneously, a sharp, precise crack came from Nora's position. The rear truck's front right tire exploded, pitching the heavy vehicle into a sickening skid until it jackknifed across the bridge's opposite end. The middle truck trapped. Engines roared, shouts cut through the storm. Men spilled out, rifles slung, trying to orient themselves in the blinding snow. One raised a flashlight, too late. Shadow erupted from the snowbank like a phantom, his black and tan form a blur. He slammed into the nearest gunman, knocking the man flat, jaws clamping on the forearm that held the weapon. The scream that followed was swallowed by the wind. Jack was already moving low and fast, his boots gripping the icy surface as he closed in on the second truck. A man appeared from the passenger side, rifle swinging toward him. Jack dove, sliding on one knee, and fired twice, center mass. The figure crumpled against the side panel, disappearing into the snow. From behind him, the deep boom of a shotgun erupted, one of theirs. The slug tore into the concrete inches from Jack's head, showering him with grit. He rolled, coming up in a crouch, his weapon tracking the source. A flash of movement, he squeezed the trigger. The shotgun wielder jerked backward, the weapon clattering onto the icy bridge. Nora's voice cut through his earpiece, low but urgent. Two more on the far side, moving toward you. Jack pivoted, pressing his back against the cold steel of the truck. He caught glimpses, dark figures moving fast, their shapes blurred by the snow. He ducked under the truck's chassis, sliding on his stomach until he was on the far side. The first man came into view, muzzle up, scanning. Jack grabbed his ankle and yanked hard, sending the man sprawling. Before he could react, Jack drove the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw, the crack audible even over the wind. The second man froze just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. A low animal growl rose from the white blur to his left, and Shadow hit him full force, knocking him back into the snow weapon, tumbling away. Jack vaulted back to the truck's side door and yanked it open. The interior smelled of oil, cold metal, and fear. Inside, under the dim light of a flickering bulb, were two large crates, both locked with heavy chains. Then came the sound, a low mechanical hum followed by a pop. Jack's eyes widened. "Booby trap," he shouted into the comm. He dove back, dragging the door closed. A muffled explosion shook the truck, sending a plume of black smoke into the storm. Not enough to destroy the vehicle, but enough to send a message Iron Veil wasn't letting anyone take their cargo alive. Through the haze, Jack saw movement near the lead truck. One of the men was shouting into a radio voice, sharp, panicked. Jack raised his rifle, but a burst of automatic fire from somewhere in the white void forced him to duck. Bullets slammed into the steel just inches from his head. Nora's rifle barked twice from her snowbank. The shouting stopped abruptly. Jack pressed forward, knowing they had seconds before reinforcements arrived. He ripped one of the chained crates partially open with his knife. Inside plastic containers, all marked with a black insignia, a stylized iron mask. Iron Veil's calling card. No time to dig deeper. He snapped photos with his phone, shoving the device back into his pocket just as the rumble of fresh engines rolled through the snow. Time to go. Nora's voice was sharp, urgent. Shadow appeared at his side, fur dusted with ice teeth, bared, but eyes locked on him, waiting for the next command. Jack tossed a smoke grenade onto the bridge. The thick gray cloud bloomed instantly, swallowing the scene. Under its cover, they slipped between the stalled trucks, boots hammering against the icy steel, moving toward the tree line at the far end. Behind them, shapes moved in the smoke shouts, turning to muffled chaos. A burst of gunfire followed them into the forest, the rounds thudding into snow and bark. The storm wrapped around them, hiding their retreat. Jack didn't stop until they were deep in the tree line, the glow of the bridge just a ghostly smear in the distance. Nora was breathing hard steam rising from her mask. "They'll know it was us." "They already did," Jack said, voice low. "Now they know we're not running anymore." Shadow shook the snow from his coat, the faintest growl still rumbling in his chest. Somewhere out there, Iron Veil was regrouping. And Jack knew this storm wasn't just weather, it was the beginning of the real war. The snow was coming down so heavily now that it felt less like a storm and more like the mountain itself was trying to bury everything alive. The bridge groaned under the weight of the ice, every gust of wind making the timbers shudder like the bones of a dying animal. Jack's lungs burned from the cold as he forced himself through the whiteout, his eyes scanning wildly. Somewhere out there, Grace's small frame was swallowed by shadows, and Shadow himself, his constant companion in this fight, was pinned somewhere in the chaos. The air was full of gunfire and the metallic ring of ricochets. Jack's instincts screamed at him to pick one direction, but his heart refused. Grace's terrified cry pierced through the blizzard, first high, thin, and choked with fear. Jack's boots crunched deep into the snow as he lunged toward the sound, every step pulling at muscles already screaming in protest. Two Iron Veil soldiers had her their silhouettes, little more than moving blotches in the swirling white. One had her by the arm, the other covering them with an assault rifle. Jack didn't think he moved. His shoulder slammed into the gunman's chest with the force of a battering ram, sending both men tumbling over the icy edge of the bridge railing. The second captor turned just in time for Jack's fist to connect with his jaw, the crack lost in the howl of the storm. Grace stumbled into his arms, clutching his jacket with a desperation that made his chest ache. "You're okay," he said, breathless, though his own voice sounded like someone else's in his ears. "I've got you." But even as relief flared, another sound sliced through the wind, a muffled whimper, low and pained. Shadow. Jack's head snapped toward the source, and his gut twisted. Through the haze, he spotted the dog's black coat dusted with snow, his massive body wedged between collapsed planks of the bridge and a twisted steel beam. His front paws clawed uselessly at the ice trapped. Behind him, the Iron Veil leader emerged like a specter, the detonator clenched in one gloved hand. His face was partially hidden by a tactical mask, but his eyes were visible cold, calculating and utterly certain of his own victory. The man didn't shout or threaten. He simply raised the detonator and pressed his thumb halfway down, letting the click echo in Jack's mind. Jack tightened his grip on Grace. His brain fired off calculations he didn't want to make run now with the girl and survive or risk everything for Shadow. And die on this bridge. Grace's voice was a whisper against his chest. "Don't let him take him from us." The decision hit like a gut punch. Jack shoved Grace behind a chunk of broken guardrail. "Stay down. No matter what happens." The leader's thumb pressed further, but before he could complete the motion, Jack hurled a combat knife. It spun end over end, embedding itself into the detonator's casing with a sharp crack, knocking it from the man's hand. The leader swore, stepping back. Jack sprinted for Shadow, ignoring the man entirely. The closer he got, the more he could see the dog's chest rising and falling shallow, but steady. Shadow's amber eyes met his, full of pain, but alive. Jack dropped to his knees in the snow, hands fumbling with the twisted metal. The steel beam wouldn't budge, but the ice beneath it had begun to soften from the warmth of Shadow's body. Jack yanked free his sidearm and fired twice into the beam's base. The recoil jarred his frozen arms, but the shots shattered the weakened ice. The beam shifted just enough for Shadow to wrench himself free, limping but mobile, a movement in his periphery too late. The leader was charging, a sidearm raised. Jack turned, drawing up his weapon, but before he could fire, a black blur intercepted the man. Shadow hit him with bone-jarring force, teeth sinking into the arm holding the gun. The weapon clattered to the snow, and the man's muffled shout was lost in the roar of the storm. Jack didn't waste the chance. He grabbed Grace, signaling to Shadow, and the three of them bolted across the bridge. Behind them, the leader scrambled for the detonator, but the damage Jack had done had jammed it. Sparks sputtered uselessly as he slammed his thumb against the button. Halfway across, Grace glanced over her shoulder. He's still coming. Jack spun his rifle, barking twice. The leader staggered, one leg buckling, but he didn't fall. He limped forward, dragging himself through the snow like a man possessed. Jack's stomach churned, not from fear, but from the cold realization that this wouldn't end here. They cleared the bridge just as a deep groan came from its center. The years of ice and strain had finally caught up. Jack pushed Grace ahead into the cover of the tree-lined Shadow close behind. The bridge gave one final shudder, then collapsed into the ravine with a roar, like a landslide swallowing the leader's figure into the abyss. For a moment, the world went quiet, except for the storm. Jack knelt, pulling Grace into an embrace, his other hand finding Shadow's thick fur. "You're both safe," he said, more to convince himself than them. Grace's face was pale, her lips trembling. "They won't stop. Not until they have us." Jack met her gaze, the unspoken truth hanging between them. "Then we make sure they never get the chance." Somewhere in the white expanse beyond, a new danger was already forming. But for now, the three of them huddled together in the snow, still breathing, still fighting, and still standing. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving behind a silence that felt deceptive, like the pause between two heartbeats. The bridge was gone, nothing left but twisted steel half buried in ice at the edges of the ravine. The three of them, Jack, Grace, and Shadow, made their way down the mountain with the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body, seeping into bone and thought. They'd won the night, but winning battles wasn't the same as ending a war. Nora was already waiting when they reached the cabin. Her face was pale under the dawn light, but her eyes burned with something sharp and unrelenting. On the table beside her sat a black, water-resistant phone, scratched, dented, and still locked. The Iron Veil leader's phone. "Tell me you didn't just risk everything for that," Jack muttered, collapsing into a chair. Nora didn't answer right away. She held the phone like it was a live grenade, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she connected it to a small device, tapping in commands. "I risked everything because this," she said finally, "is the artery. Cut this and the heart stops beating." The screen blinked to life after a few minutes of code work. Nora's lips tightened as line after line of encrypted text scrolled past. Maps, transaction logs, names, so many names. Jack leaned in, scanning the list, recognizing some from whispered rumors, others from wanted bulletins. "This isn't just Montana," Nora said, voice low but steady. "Iron Veil has hubs in Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas. They've been moving weapons and people across state lines for years, right under federal radar." Jack's jaw clenched. Not anymore. They worked in grim silence, extracting every byte of data, copying files onto secure drives. Each folder opened like a wound. Photos of illegal shipments tucked into grain trucks, lists of payments to dirty officials, maps marking drop points in small rural towns where no one would notice a truck in the night. Grace, wrapped in a blanket, sat on the couch with Shadow pressed against her legs. Her eyes followed every movement, as if even now she didn't quite trust that the danger was over. Jack caught her gaze once, and she looked away, the weight of what she'd been through pressing in. By mid-afternoon, Nora had everything she needed. She looked at Jack, her expression leaving no room for argument. "We can't just sit on this. The longer it's in our hands, the greater the chance they find us. We take it to the FBI now." Jack's instinct was to push back. He'd spent years avoiding federal agencies working in the shadows where their reach didn't tangle him. But this was different. This wasn't about him, it was about cutting out a cancer before it grew back. The nearest FBI field office was 2 hours away, and the roads were still slick with ice. They traveled in 2 vehicles, Jack driving the old truck with Grace and Shadow Nora following behind in her SUV with the evidence locked in a steel case. Every bump and rattle felt like an ambush waiting to happen. When they finally pulled into the secure garage of the field office, it felt anticlimactic. No gunfire, no last-minute chase, just the heavy door closing behind them and the echo of their boots on concrete. Inside, an agent in a dark suit met them, eyes narrowing as Nora presented her credentials and the case. "Where'd you get this?" the agent asked, his tone more suspicious than curious. Nora didn't flinch. "From the body of the man who was about to blow a bridge in half to erase his crimes." She stepped closer, her voice sharpening. "You want details? Start with the data on that phone. It'll keep your entire task force busy for a year." The agent hesitated, then motioned for another to take the case. Within minutes, a small tech team was extracting files in a secure lab. Jack and Nora watched through a glass wall as the team leader's expression shifted from mild skepticism to something closer to shock. He came out holding a printed sheet. "This is comprehensive? You've got their safe houses, laundering routes, encrypted bank accounts. We've been after even one of these nodes for months. You've got them all." Nora's voice was ice. "Then you understand what you have to do with it. Iron Veil doesn't get a second chance." The wheels of federal machinery turned faster than Jack expected. That evening, while they were still giving statements, the first raids began. Helicopters lifted off from nearby airfields, teams in tactical gear fanning out across multiple states. One by one, the names from the phone lit up on a board in the command center, marked with green check marks as arrests came in. Grace sat beside Jack, watching it all unfold. She didn't smile, there was too much damage for that. But some of the fear in her eyes eased. Ellie, her mother, was brought in under heavy escort, pale and trembling, but alive. When she saw Grace, she broke into sobs, clutching her daughter like she'd never let go again. Jack turned away, giving them a moment, his own chest tightening. Later, in a quiet conference room, an FBI liaison explained the next steps. Ellie and Grace will be placed in the witness security program. New identities, new lives. They'll be safe. He glanced at Jack. "As for you, we can arrange protection," but Jack shook his head. "I'm not the one they'll be looking for. My face isn't on their kill list. Theirs are." Ellie, still holding Grace's hand, looked at him with gratitude that didn't need words. "You've done enough. More than enough." Nora was standing by the door, arms folded, watching everything with that same unreadable intensity. When the agents left, she stepped forward, lowering her voice. "It's not just about putting them in new houses with new names. They're going to need people in their corner, even if it's from a distance. People who know what's out there." Jack met her gaze. "You volunteering?" A faint smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe I am." By midnight, the paperwork was done, the protective details arranged. Grace hugged Shadow one last time before the handlers led her and Ellie out. The dog stood in the hallway, tail low, watching them disappear into the elevator. Jack rested a hand on his head. "She'll remember you," he murmured. "You saved her more than once." When the elevator doors closed, the building seemed quieter, emptier. The war with Iron Veil wasn't just over. It was dismantled piece by piece, and the people at its core were scattering like smoke. But the cost was etched into every face Jack had seen that day. Outside, the cold night air hit like a slap. Jack and Nora walked together toward the parking lot, the crunch of their boots on the ice, the only sound. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's blades chopped through the darkness, carrying another team to another arrest. "It's done," Nora said, her breath misting in the air. Jack glanced at her. "Nothing like this is ever done. But it's enough for now." Shadow padded between them, his steady presence grounding them both. And for the first time in days, Jack let himself believe they'd bought more than just survival. They'd bought a future. The wind off the mountains carried the scent of snow and pine, sharp and clean. But there was a heaviness in the air that even the cold couldn't clear. The transport van idled at the edge of the small town's only road, its exhaust curling into the white morning like smoke from a quiet fire. Jack stood a few feet back from it, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching as the final minutes ticked down. Ellie was the first to emerge from the little safe house where they had been staying. She still wore the knitted hat Nora had given her, pulled low over her ears, her thin coat buttoned all the way up. In her small hands, she clutched the sketchbook that had become her anchor in the chaos. She walked straight toward him without hesitation. For all the fear that had haunted her eyes when they first met there was only certainty now. She stopped in front of him, tilting her head up so their eyes met. "You brought us out of the dark," she whispered the words, carrying more weight than the air around them. Her voice was steady, but it wrapped around his chest like a thread pulling something tight inside. He didn't trust himself to speak. His jaw clenched as he forced a small nod, the only answer he could manage without breaking. Then Grace appeared slower, almost reluctant. She had been the silent one, the one who measured every glance, every gesture before letting her guard down. Now, though, she carried herself differently. When she reached him, she looked up a faint smile, her first softening the edges of her guarded expression. She reached out her mittened hand, brushing against Shadow's head. The dog leaned into her, touch tail swaying slowly. Jack caught the look in Grace's eyes, gratitude without words, trust rebuilt one fragile brick at a time. Behind them, Nora leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching the exchange. Her gaze lingered on Jack longer than on the girls. She didn't need to speak to tell him what she was thinking. He had seen that same look before in war zones and safe houses from people who wanted someone to stay, but knew better than to ask. Still, when the girls had climbed into the van and the driver closed the door with a muffled thud, she stepped toward him. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "This town could use someone like you. I could use someone like you." For a second, the thought tempted him. The image of days without pursuit of nights, without the echo of gunfire pressed against his mind. But he knew better. He had too many scars that hadn't finished bleeding, wounds that would only reopen if he tried to pretend they didn't exist. "Not yet," he told her, shaking his head slightly. "There are things I still have to put to rest." She didn't push. Instead, she gave him a single nod, the kind that said she understood even if she didn't like it. Shadow moved closer to his side, sensing the shift in him. The dog's breath steamed in the cold as it looked up at him, ready to follow wherever he went next. The van's engine growled, tires crunching over the packed snow as it began to pull away. Ellie's small face appeared in the frosted window, one hand pressed against the glass. Grace sat beside her, Shadow's faint paw prints still fresh where she had petted him. Jack stood there until the van was a blur in the white swallowed by distance and the low curtain of falling snow. Silence settled over the street. The town seemed smaller without the girls in it, quieter in a way that wasn't comforting. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath ghosting in the air. He felt the ache of what they had all been through, what they had survived, but also the strange lightness that came with knowing they were safe. Nora stepped up beside him. "You'll keep moving, then," she said, not as a question, but a statement. He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something almost like a smile. "It's what I do." Her eyes searched his face for something more, but he turned away, adjusting the strap of the pack slung over his shoulder. The path out of town stretched ahead, a narrow trail lined with snowbanks and flanked by tall pines. It looked lonely, but he had walked worse roads. Shadow fell into step with him, paws silent on the snow. The two of them moved without hurry, but without looking back. Jack didn't need to. He carried enough of the past with him already. The rest was better left behind. And somewhere far down the road, he knew there would be another fight, another shadowed corner that needed light. He would be there when it came, because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that you didn't get to choose when the darkness came for someone. You only got to choose whether you stepped into it with them. The snow kept falling, the sound of their steps fading into the hush of the winter morning, until they were just two more shapes moving forward into the white. The package arrived without warning. No return address. No markings except his name written in a looping, careful hand he didn't recognize. It had been snowing since before dawn, the kind of slow, steady snowfall that swallowed sound and blurred the edges of the world. Jack had been outside splitting wood when the courier's truck rumbled up the winding road to his cabin tires slipping slightly on the ice. The driver had offered a polite nod, handed him the parcel, and left without a word. He carried it inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. The cabin was warm from the fire, but there was still that quiet mountain chill clinging to the air. On the table he set the package down and just looked at it for a moment. He'd learned to be cautious with surprises. But something about this, its weight, its size, the way the handwriting curved, pulled at him in a way he couldn't quite name. The blade of his pocket knife sliced neatly through the twine. Inside, under a layer of folded brown paper, was a photograph. Not just any photograph. Ellie, Grace, and Shadow. The girls were standing in what looked like a small backyard sunlight slanting through a weathered wooden fence. Patches of green grass stubbornly pushing up through late spring snow. Ellie was taller now, her hair a little longer, but her smile still had that spark he'd seen for the first time in the safe house. Grace stood beside her, one arm slung awkwardly around Ellie's shoulders, her other hand resting on Shadow's back. And Shadow God, the dog, looked almost smug. His coat thick and healthy eyes bright, as if he'd finally found a place worth guarding. Beneath the photo was a small cream-colored card. Handwritten in blue ink, the words were simple. Family isn't where you're born. It's where you're found. No signature, no address, just that sentence. Jack sat back in his chair, the fire crackling behind him, and let the photo rest on the table. He stared at it long enough for the edges of his vision to blur. They looked safe. Not just alive, but safe. It was something he hadn't dared to imagine for them in those first nights when danger felt like it was breathing down their necks every second. He felt the old tension in his shoulders loosen just a fraction. It had been a year since the van drove them out of that frozen street, since he'd stood in the falling snow and watched them disappear into the horizon. A year of moving from place to place, taking work when he needed it, staying invisible when he didn't. He'd told himself it was better that way, that letting go was the only way to keep them safe. But now, seeing their faces again, he realized it wasn't about safety anymore. It was about knowing that what they'd all fought for had lasted. That the darkness hadn't come back. He rose from the table and crossed to the window. Outside, the snow was still falling thicker now, settling into the pine branches until they bent under the weight. The mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks vanishing into low clouds. Down in the valley, just visible through the shifting white, was the town. Small, stubborn, and quiet. He hadn't been back there since the day he left. Not really. Sometimes he'd pass through on his way to somewhere else, stopping just long enough to buy supplies or check a road before heading out again. But he never lingered. Too many ghosts. Today felt different. Jack pulled on his coat, the same battered one he'd worn that winter. The cold met him at the door, crisp and unflinching, but not unwelcome. He followed the narrow path up the hill behind the cabin, Shadow's absence beside him, feeling strange even now. The climb was slow, the snow deep in places, the wind rising the higher he went. When he reached the ridge, the view opened up before him. The town lay below like a handful of scattered lights, roofs dusted white, the river cutting a dark ribbon through the center. From here it looked peaceful, almost untouched. But Jack knew every street had its shadows. He knew peace was never something you found by accident. It had to be fought for again and again. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound, distant but unmistakable. A bark. He froze, listening. Another bark, then a third, carried across the valley. It was impossible to tell if it was Shadow's voice or just another dog in another yard. But something about the rhythm of it made his chest tighten. A year ago, that sound would have been a call to action, a warning. Today it felt different. Today it felt like a reminder. He let the wind push past him, ruffling his hair, tugging at the edges of his coat. Somewhere down there, the girls were building a life. Somewhere Shadow was still keeping watch. And here he was, still standing still, breathing, still ready to do what had to be done when the time came. Jack didn't smile often, but he did now, small, almost imperceptible, but real. The kind of smile that didn't come from joy, so much as from knowing you'd made the right call, even if it cost you. He stayed on the ridge a while longer, watching the snow sweep across the valley, the town disappearing and reappearing between the gusts. Eventually, he turned back toward the cabin, the photograph tucked safely inside his coat pocket. The wind followed him down, and with it came that distant barking again, fainter now, but still there, threading itself into the silence like a promise. By the time he reached his door, the light had shifted the sun low behind the clouds, casting the snow in a pale gold. He stepped inside, closed the door against the cold, and laid the photograph back on the table. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. Outside the mountain, winter pressed on. But somewhere in the distance, past the white and the wind, there was warmth. And that was enough. The fire popped, the wind howled, and faintly, so faintly, it could have been memory. He thought he heard shadows bark once more.